It's 7 o'clock. I'm Dermot Menahan. This is Sky News Tonight. The top story, a spring statement aimed at easing the cost of living. The Chancellor presents his plan aiming to offset the pain of rising national insurance contributions with a lift to the threshold.
My tax plan delivers the biggest net cut to personal taxes in over a quarter of a century.
Help on the forecourts as well as fuel duty is cut by 5 pence. But Labour accuse him of making the wrong choices as households suffer the highest inflation for 3 decades. A very good evening and welcome to a special programme looking at today's spring statement. When Rishi Sunak entered number 11 Downing Street 2 years ago, he did so with hopes of becoming a low-tax Chancellor. Well, COVID, of course, soon put paid to that, with soaring public spending and borrowing. And 2 years on, the economic cost of lockdowns remains, and there's a long way to go now in restoring the public finances. Today's mini-budget did, however, see some concessions, a rise in the national insurance contribution threshold and a cut to fuel duty. But Labour said not enough, accusing him of missing the chance of an energy windfall tax and opting instead for the wrong tax at the wrong time. In a moment, our economics editor breaks down exactly what today's announcements mean for people's pay packets. But first, let's take a look at what those changes are precisely. So his first big announcement was to cut fuel duty by 5 pence from 6 p.m. this evening until March next year. So it's already in operation. Homeowners installing heat pumps, insulation and solar panels will pay no VAT for the next 5 years. Although the Chancellor stopped short of cancelling a planned increase in national insurance contributions, he said he will increase the threshold by £3,000, meaning that employees will be able to earn £12,570 without paying any national insurance. And not only did the Chancellor announce partial tax cuts for now, but he announced tax cuts to come. Income tax will be reduced from 20 to 19 pence in the pound by the end of the Parliament in 2024, he said. The Chancellor also revised down the UK's gross domestic product growth forecast for this year to 3.8%, saying there is uncertainty about how much of an impact the conflict in Ukraine will have on the economy. And Rishi Sunak's statement came after inflation reached a 30-year high. It's now 6.2% in the 12 months to February, putting extra pressure on the Chancellor to help households with rising living costs. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has tonight's top report.
A mini-budget, but this a generational crisis. Inflation at a level not seen for 3 decades, and it's going to get worse.
Is there more pain to come, Chancellor?
Rishi Sunak under pressure to meet the scale of this moment, armed with a statement that for so many will decide if they can heat their homes and feed their families.
Rishi Sunak.
From COVID to cost of living, the emergency Chancellor promising to step in again.
People should know that we will stand by them as we have throughout the last 2 years. Today, I can announce for only the second time in 20 years, fuel duty will be cut. Not by 1, not even by 2, but by 5 pence per litre. The biggest cut to all fuel duty rates ever.
A year-long cut on fuel duty. Labour bench is unimpressed. But the big reveal still to come, easing the pain on the April national insurance hike.
Our current plan is to increase the NICS threshold this year by £300. But I'm not going to do that, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to increase it by the full £3,000. From this July, people will be able to earn £12,570 a year without paying a single penny of income tax or national insurance.
And a tax promise from a Chancellor already eyeing the next election.
I can confirm before the end of this Parliament in 2024, for the first time in 16 years, the basic rate of income tax will be cut. from 20 to 19 pence in the pound. A tax cut for workers, for pensioners, for savers. A £5 billion tax cut for 30 million people.
The opposition clear this simply not enough.
Inflation is at its highest level for 30 years and rising. Energy prices at record highs. People are worried sick. For all his words, it is clear that the Chancellor does not understand the scale of the challenge.
Tax cuts always put a spring in the step of Conservative MPs, but the outlook far from sunny. Official figures forecast the biggest fall in living standards this year since the 1950s. And minimal help today for the worst off.
What the Chancellor did today was to help a little bit for people on low to moderate earnings, but he did nothing at all, actually, for people who are out of work and dependent on benefits, and they're really perhaps going to find it the biggest struggle over the next several months. When that next rise in energy prices comes, next one in April, another one around October, I think there will be more pressure on the Chancellor because there are going to be more households, particularly, again, the very poorest, who are really going to be struggling at that point.
For all the rhetoric around tax cuts, this mini-budget really lived up to name today. This a package of measures that barely even scratches the surface when it comes to dealing with the biggest fall in living standards in over 60 years. The Chancellor, for now, is biding his time in the face of huge economic uncertainty. But one ally did concede to me tonight that Mr Sunak is likely to have to do more in the autumn, if not before. Millions of voters are going to feel the pain of rising prices this year, and petrol only part of our problem, and this man's too.
30 quid, 30 pounds.
Not a crisis of his making, but one he'll be expected to help fix.
Beth's here with me now with more analysis. So, Beth, I mean, first of all, on the politics, how has it gone down with the various factions within the Conservative Party?
Well, look, I think people wanted more. When the Chancellor stood up today and said, we stood by people 2 years ago over COVID and we will keep standing by them, that is not the feeling that the public have. In fact, there's a poll just out from Opinion tonight. It's just landed. Only 27% of the UK public think the spring statement measures will have a positive effect on their personal finances. And when you look at what the Chancellor announced, Dermot, I mean, basically he reversed but a sixth of the tax rises he's implemented in the past couple of years. There was a big windfall that many Conservative MPs wanted him to begin spending. This is because of higher than expected growth and better than expected tax receipts. The FT estimating that's about £50 billion of additional headroom the Chancellor has. He's holding on to that. Now, you have to have a little bit of sympathy for him here. Why is he doing it? Because of the volatility. They don't really know what's going to happen to energy prices. They don't understand yet how the economic sanctions and the war in Ukraine, how long it will go on for, how it will feed into the economic outlook. And so he's keeping his powder dry. He's holding on to money. He's waiting to give himself a cushion for additional measures. But I would be very surprised if the Chancellor does not have to make further announcements in the summer or in the autumn. Don't forget, energy bills go up. The cap rises to £2,000 in April. It could go up to £3,000 in October. That's another massive chunk of money that people will have to find. So the pressure is on. I think this was rather like you remember in COVID times when there would be an economic statement and then a few weeks later another. I wonder whether we are moving back into that territory now in the coming months.
And the opposition, I mean, very critical about the lack of a windfall tax on energy companies and pointing out that there's nothing there really for people on benefits, people who don't drive cars, the very poorest.
Well, that's exactly it. And actually, the OBR was saying that in terms of the cost of living squeeze of 2.2% per household, these measures today only really ameliorated a third of that. So 2/3 of it untouched, which is what Labour are getting at, which is you haven't got it, you need to do more. What the Chancellor there was doing, as I said, I think it's a holding pattern where he gives himself some manoeuvrability. Look, Dermot, I think the biggest issue of all of this is in 2019, this government promised to level up the country, and they were elected on the back of Brexit and also improving people's livelihoods and their standards of living and the way they felt about where their lives getting better. And ultimately, if you get to 2024 and people are struggling to make ends meet, they are not going to feel better off. So a government that's promising tax cuts in 2 years' time, they'll say, well, you didn't keep the promises of 2019. And I think that's the biggest challenge for the government in the coming months, to prove to the public that they can improve their living standards. OK,
Beth, thanks for the analysis. Beth Rigby, our political editor there. Well, as you heard, inflation at a 30-year high now, a pending lift on the energy price cap, and rises in national insurance contributions. The perfect storm, perhaps, as Britain faces a cost of living crisis. So how exactly will today's announcements help, and could the Chancellor have done more? Our data and economics editor, Ed Conway, has his analysis.
This was supposed to just be an update, but in practice there were lots of new policies and new figures, and particularly striking ones underlining the state of what we are going to be going through over the next few months. This shows you household disposable income. This is a chart that just was out from the Office of Budget Responsibility. Anything above the line shows we are getting better off, and we're going all the way back now to 1956. And you can see that most of these bars through the years, from the 50s to the 60s to the 70s and 80s and 90s, are above the line. We're getting better off. And there's the financial crisis, a few years where it was below the line. But just look at this red bar. That's the year we're going into now, and that bar is the lowest it has ever been, the biggest fall in our real household disposable income that we've seen in statistical record. That is what we are confronting at the moment. That's the cost of living crisis. And the Chancellor has managed to make that bar a little bit less deep than it would otherwise have been, but nonetheless, it is still going to be very tough indeed. How has he made it less deep? Well, it comes down to money going out of the Treasury. How much money is going out? We can see each year, if we look at the total policies and the impact, you can see there was money going into the Treasury in the year that we're in at the moment. But next year, a bit of money going out, actually quite a lot of money, £8.4 billion, and then smaller amounts in the future years. It's worth us just breaking down that money that is going out, because that's what we're talking about here, all of these policies that have been announced by the Chancellor. And when it comes to breaking it down, there are some interesting things. In fact, on top of the money that's going out, and we'll look at that in a second, there is a bit of extra money coming in. Student loans, because of a change in the way that they're calculated, students will end up paying more money in the coming years, and that's banked by the Treasury. But then you've got that cash going out. That's helping to finance that change in the national insurance threshold, an extra £3,000 that you kind of don't have to pay national insurance on, quite a lot of money. Fuel duty as well, £2.4 billion. Not the biggest chunk, but nonetheless pretty big. And then that's the energy bills package that we had just not too long ago from the Chancellor, £9 billion, just over £9 billion. But here's the thing, he could have spent more. And that's the big question mark. Do we see him come back later when that cost of living crisis starts to bear down on everyone and spend a little bit more money? The final thing that's worth saying, there was that tax plan from the Chancellor, a document underlining how much he wants to get those taxes down. But here's a chart that wasn't in it. This is the tax burden, taxes as a percentage of GDP, just how heavily taxed we are as an economy. Again, going all the way back through to history to the post-war period. And have a look at this line. It's relatively low, and it kind of hangs around this area, kind of 33 or so percent. But even when income tax has been cut by a penny, which he plans to do towards the end of this Parliament, it's still, this line, going to be the highest it's been since 1949, underlining the fact that though he wants to be seen as a tax-cutting Chancellor, the statistics tell a very different story indeed. So those are some of the data from this big moment for the Chancellor, far bigger than most people expected. It was supposed to just be a spring statement. It felt actually a bit more like a budget.
Just to let you know, Ed's going to be joining me at past this hour, along with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, to give us an even deeper analysis of what the Chancellor just announced today. But first, the British Chambers of Commerce has said today's statement by the Chancellor fell short of what is needed to support business. They called the cut to fuel duty a drop in the ocean in the face of the tsunami of surging costs. Well, in a moment, I'll be speaking to the head of the BCC, Siobhan Haviland, about the impact on British business. But first, our correspondent, Paul Kelso, has this report.
Pulling the trigger at the pump is a painful business, particularly if your business is driving.
It's just getting to a point where, is it worth it anymore? It's just, well, I'm taking no wages out at the minute. I'm funding the extra fuel costs.
Paul has a council contract to transport disabled children to school, but the fuel price was set in 2019, so he loses money on every mile, even allowing for the 5p cut in fuel duty announced by the Chancellor.
No, it won't make no difference whatsoever, but every little helps. It'd have to be 20, 30, 40p a litre to help save. 3 months ago, we was probably paying £1.17, £1.18 a litre. Now it's gone up to just locally 182, nearly 183 a litre. And obviously 10 vehicles using between 60 and 80 litres a week becomes expensive.
Keeping production lines moving has got more expensive too. There's no energy price cap for business and no new measures to help companies like this packaging manufacturer. In the modern economy, everything from eggs to engines comes in a box, so price rises here will be delivered to our doors one way or another.
Energy bills were around £7,000 a month. We're fixed until mid-2023. That 7,000 goes to 18,000, and we're one of the lower energy consumers within the supply chain.
With inflation at a 30-year high of 6.2% even before Russia invaded Ukraine, worse is to come. What makes energy and fuel inflation so pernicious is it affects the price of everything, from raw materials to transport, even the pallets goods are loaded on. It's almost inevitable manufacturers have to pass on these costs to consumers. There's very little the Chancellor can do about it. Food price inflation may see the steepest increase of all. Iceland has 1,000 stores, many in the least prosperous communities. The boss says the Chancellor should have done more to insulate his business and his customers.
Business is not some endless sponge that can forever soak this stuff up. We talk rightly about the consumer, and I think that's important, but also the government needs to protect business as well, because ultimately it's the consumer that pays for it. So what I would have liked to have seen was a price cap on energy for business.
Rebuilding the economy after COVID was never going to be straightforward. Businesses face the hardest year yet, knowing they'll have to stand or fall alone. Paul Kelso, Sky News in Staffordshire.
Let's get more business reaction then. I'm joined by Siobhan Haviland, Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce. Very good evening to you, Siobhan Haviland. I know you have welcomed the cut in fuel duty, but not enough.
Hi, good evening. No, really not enough. This was an opportunity for the Chancellor to really do something for business. As you know, businesses have been facing into a tsunami of costs starting last summer with an increase in raw material costs, massive increases in shipping costs. We saw difficulties in recruitment and energy prices start to rise last winter. But of course, energy prices are now at an unprecedented level. I had a call from one of our businesses last week whose energy prices are going up from £14,000 a month to £46,000 a month next month. So there's a real issue with price, with costs, and we really wanted to see the Chancellor do something on possibly delaying the national insurance increases or looking at a temporary energy price cap for small and medium-sized businesses.
OK, so because there is no price cap, of course, for businesses, what kind of level would you like to see and how would it operate?
So many small businesses buy energy like consumers do. But of course, unlike consumers, they don't have a price cap nor a rebate system. And unlike big businesses, they don't have a deep balance sheet to see them through. So we would like to see them look at what sort of either energy price cap, temporary one, or possibly a rebate scheme would work. You know, businesses welcomed things like the increase of the employment allowance, and as you referenced earlier, the cut in fuel duty, and the Chancellor did also talk about looking at future taxes, reforming apprenticeships, looking at R&D credits, and businesses welcome all of those things. But we've got an immediate crunch that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, and the big looming threat out there is inflation. And one imagines then that if there is no real help for businesses in dealing with these rising costs, they, of course, pass on the costs to the consumer, and we get this inflationary circle.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we run a quarterly economic survey. Inflation has been the number one issue for businesses for the last 3 quarters in a row. And that is the first time it's ever been a number one issue since the survey was started in 1989. You can see how significant that is. And businesses, they try to absorb those costs for as long as possible. They don't want to pass on prices to either to their supply chain or to consumers, but eventually they have to. And in our last survey in February, 75% of businesses said that they were going to have to pass on those costs. And of course, that was before the events we've seen in the Ukraine.
And presumably businesses then going to have precious little surplus to invest and therefore to improve productivity, which we all want to see.
Yeah. I mean, 2 years of COVID meant cash flow and cash reserves for investment were already at an all-time low. So now they've got extra costs to absorb. It's going to be really tricky. And businesses they'll do a number of things. So they'll stop recruiting and they will pause on investments. And we don't want to see that, because what we want from the Chancellor is helping to control those costs so that businesses can get back to investing and get back to growing, because that's what they want to do, driving the economy.
Let me mention lastly the R word. We're always told let's not talk ourselves into recession, but do you fear one is looming?
I think our feedback from our members has been that they have been able to absorb a lot of the on-costs while they've seen their order books looking strong and steady. And I think their worry is that they're beginning to see a slowdown in those orders. And that obviously leads them to start thinking about the R word. And we don't want that to happen. We want to avoid that tipping point. OK,
Siobhan Haviland, very good talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. Siobhan Haviland there from the British Chambers of Commerce. And, of course, reaction to the Chancellor's statement certain to feature all over tomorrow's papers. We've got our extended press preview and news review at 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the Daily Mail's consultant editor, Andrew Pearce, and the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire. And you're watching a special programme on the Chancellor's spring statement, spring budget, so to speak. Coming up, we're going to be in Bury and Greater Manchester, gauging the reception to today's announcements amongst voters.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. If there is a bigger explosion, this area would be in the danger zone. These traffic jams snake for hours up and down this hillside. It means pressures aid can't access those in need. You can see the depth of the water. If you have a look in front of us, there are people wading through it. I think experiencing the 2 million person march in Hong Kong, that was a moment.
I don't like the Chinese government. It's cruel.
It was real people power in action.
Police have been firing tear gas and rubber bullets.
See fires all around us here, and just one of them is the size of around 31,000 football pitches. Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Bangkok.
Now then, in responding to Rishi Sunak's statement in the House of Commons today, the Shadow Chancellor accused him of not understanding the scale of the challenge facing families. Rachel Reeves pointed out the lack of changes to universal credit to help offset rising inflation. Despite this, Mr Sunak claimed that 70% of people who pay national insurance will pay less of it. Our correspondent Inzamam Rashid has been in Bury and Greater Manchester, seeing how the Chancellor's statement went down with voters.
This is what the cost of living crisis looks like. A choice between feeding your kids or heating your home. A choice Dawn is faced with day in and day out.
The more you're worrying about how am I going to pay this, the worse you actually feel. And then an announcement like this comes along and you feel even worse. And you're worrying even more, and it's a bit of a nightmare.
And today that nightmare continued. The Chancellor's statement didn't include anything to benefit those on universal credit. Dawn says the £300 a year she'll save from the national insurance changes is non-existent.
We're paying that out already, or we are going to be from the looks of it, with the amount that fuel and food and everything's going up. And it just feels like no matter what we're trying, we're not getting anywhere. And we're actually getting worse and worse off.
Thankfully, it was a warm spring day at Bury Market, a welcome stark difference from life at home in the cold, a life Irene and Lila are used to.
I don't put my central heating on. I've been and bought, I think it was about 25 quid for this big blanket thing, and I put that on at night, just sit under it, you know.
Do you think the politicians down in London, do you think they understand the situation?
No. They'll be rolling in it.
£1.50, £2, £200, £150 is that, to help people out? What would he do with 150 or 200? Go for a meal.
Stephen feels the politicians listen, but not enough. He's thankful to see the price of fuel drop, but with it at a record high, he's worried it's still too much.
My concern is that people come from far and wide to Bury Market. It's going to cost them to get here with fuel prices. It's going to cost them all to get here. And then they've got to pay for your parking and etc, etc. It just goes on and on.
This is a crisis that will inevitably hurt the poorest the most, but the suffering will be widespread. Millions of households across the country are bracing themselves to feel the pain when it deepens next month. Inzamam Rashid, Sky News, Bury.
Well, you're watching a special programme on the Chancellor's spring statement. Coming up, we're in Bury. No, we're not. We've just been there. We're going to be discussing it all with our economics editor and our deputy political editor. Welcome back. You're watching our special programme on the Chancellor's spring statement today. In it, he raised the national insurance threshold by £3,000 and announced a cut in fuel duty by 5p a litre. His mini-budget, which is what it became, aimed at easing the burden of the cost of living crisis. In a moment, we'll be speaking to the Treasury Minister, John Glenn. But first, let's see how today's announcements will affect people's pockets. I'm joined now by our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, and our deputy political editor, Sam Coates. Good to see you both. Ed, let's start with you. And overall, how much trouble are we in? And is inflation at the heart of it?
Yeah, I mean, inflation is, the big story here. Normally, when it comes to these kinds of events, like the spring statement, we're looking at things like the growth numbers, we're looking at the state of the economy. We sometimes focus on inflation, but frankly, most of these kind of events talk about it going to kind of like be as close as possible to 2%. That's the Bank of England's forecast. This time around, very different indeed. I'll bring up the inflation numbers so you just get a sense of that. And you can kind of see when you see those inflation numbers just how serious that is. That's not coming up at the moment, but I will tell you that previously the forecast was for inflation to be around 4%. Now the expectation is it's going to peak at about 8% or just above 8%. And if that is indeed the case, then we're talking about a severe cost of living crisis. And when you look at the impact of that cost of living crisis on families' pockets, well, we're talking about something that we really have rarely seen before. We're talking about, so when you look at real household disposable incomes, the biggest fall that we've seen since the 1950s. I mean, it is a striking number and one that we've been kind of trying to digest over the course of the day. But what's doubly striking is the fact that the Chancellor, while he has reduced it somewhat, so he's reduced it by about a third, the impact of what we're going to experience over the course of the next few months, he could have done more. And I think that's the thing that he will be kind of reflecting on over the course of the next few months as we see more stories of many people across the country from all income levels facing this cost of living crisis, people opening their bills, realising that they are facing a serious crisis on their bills. As a result of that, and the question mark as to whether he's got kind of more money left, we may well see him have to come back to the table. He got about £20 billion of extra revenue from the fact that inflation has been high at the moment. That has brought in more taxes, but he didn't spend all of it. And I think that's the big question, Dermot, is whether he comes back and tries to spend that later on.
OK, Ed, I'm going to come back to you and you can put some numbers on that when you get the spanner out and fix your screen there. Let's talk to Sam while you do that. And Sam, as we're hearing there, because of inflation, real incomes are falling. That is a real political problem for any party.
That's right. And you've got to look at the two big choices that Rishi Sunak made today. The first was, as Ed was saying, not to spend all the money. So basically today there was a bill of about £27 billion for the measures that he did, things like raising the personal allowance, the amount that you can receive before starting to pay national insurance, for that income tax cut in 2024 by 1p, and for the fuel duty drop. Now, all of those things pretty much are universal measures. You'll benefit, I'll benefit from them. They're not targeted at the lowest paid. And the consequence of that is that Rishi Sunak has spent quite a lot of money today helping people arguably who didn't entirely need to be helped. Because I think the striking choice that he made, and it was a political choice, and it's a choice that, as far as I can tell, is being endorsed by Conservative MPs from all wings of the party, is not to do things like put more money into the benefit system, which universal credit, for instance, for people who are part-time work or low income or have families. So you look at the various groups that weren't particularly helped today. Pensioners weren't particularly given a handout by the Chancellor. People on part-time work weren't particularly helped. People who don't have a job, who perhaps are unemployed, can't get a job for whatever reason, those people didn't get a particular help, particular assistance from the Chancellor. All those earning under 9,000, maybe because they don't work 5 days a week. So those are the groups that were already going to suffer the most and won't have really benefited from today.
OK, let's go back to Ed, who's now got his screen working. And Ed, tell us then, you mentioned that the Chancellor's keeping some of his powder dry, so to speak. How much wriggle room has he got with the money?
Yeah, I don't know if it was obvious that I was kind of scrambling beneath the surface there, but now this does seem to be working. I'll show you a couple of things, OK, that go to that point. OK, first of all, the squeeze that we're facing at the moment is worth just kind of reflecting on, because I think it is impossible to think about the state of the economy at the moment without thinking about this bar here. This bar here, the big fall in disposable income that we are facing in the next year. You see that one there? That is the lowest that we've ever seen since these records began. In fact, I think you have to go back. This starts in the 1950s. I think you actually have to go back to the 1920s, the mid-1920s. That was a terrible period for the UK economy. We rejoined the gold standard. It was disastrous. Wages fell very, very sharply. So if that's what we're about to go through, you know, there was a big question mark over, you know, people are talking about whether the Chancellor has done enough. You know, we are talking about a totemic fall in people's living standards, which everyone will experience. As for where that money might come from, well, you know, if you look at kind of just a breakdown of some of the money that kind of went out of the Treasury and some of the money that came back in, you know, a certain amount did go out. What we've got here basically is showing this bar is kind of, you know, neutral, that's zero, and then everything else there is money going out. A lot was spent on national insurance, so the threshold going up. A decent amount was spent on fuel duty, 2.4 billion, and then you had that energy bills, the support there for energy bills that we saw that was announced just a few months ago. But here's the thing, there is more money left to spend. And why is that? It's because it's up to the Chancellor as to what fiscal rules he sets himself. And that's a determination that he can make. You know, there's no rule that says you've only got so much to spend other than what you think is possible. And that comes back to something else, debt interest. Just how high are interest rates and how comfortable is he with them? And again, that's a question that no one else can answer but himself. Debt interest is going to be really high in the next year, but as a percentage of GDP, it's not that high compared with some periods in the 80s, and it goes down quite quickly. So I think he will be forced to come back and give more answers about why he hasn't done more, why that bar's not going out even further, given the historic scale of what we're going through at the moment, Dermot.
OK, thanks for that. And so, Sam, how has that not doing more gone down with some of his backbenchers? I mean, on this national insurance rise, yes, there's been some help in terms of rising the threshold by £3,000, but they wanted to see it cancelled altogether.
That's right, but I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that this evening there is some kind of particularly big grumble on the Tory backbenchers about today's plan. Think of it very, very cynically in terms of different groups inside the Conservative Party. There are fans of Boris Johnson who just want everything that this government does to go well, and they are cheering this mini-budget. There are opponents of Boris Johnson who quite like Rishi Sunak. Now, they also want the Chancellor to do well, and they were cheering the budget when I spoke to them earlier. And there are those on the One Nation wing who quite like the pro-jobs policy as they saw it. There are some on the right who like the package that they saw it because there was no injection of cash into universal credit. So if you look around the Tory party, I didn't find a great deal of dissent and haven't seen any being reported elsewhere. But here's the thing. Tonight, the first polls have dropped, and they're not that good. 66% of people say that they think that the spring statement doesn't benefit people like them much. That's a poll from YouGov. 69% of Britons say the spring statement has not done enough to help with the cost of living. And I bet you, Dermot, some of that is because, frankly, what happened today was just plain weird. Because last autumn, Rishi Sunak announced that he was going to do a great big tax rise using national insurance. And then today, he clawed back some of that rise. He sort of deadened its impact and essentially cut the amount of money he was going to get from that rise by tweaking the allowance that you can raise before you start to pay it. So he's giving with one hand, taking away with the other. I think a lot of people are just looking at that and going, what?
Sam Coates, Ed Conway. Thank you both very much indeed. Well, I want to speak now to someone who worked very closely with the Chancellor when it comes to the decisions made and announced in the spring statement. I'm joined by John Glenn MP, City Minister and Economic Secretary to the Treasury. Very good evening to you, Mr Glenn. And let me put that very point to you then. Why didn't the Chancellor do even more, given it seems he had some wriggle room with the finances?
Well, I recognise that wriggle room that he's left, and it's directly because of the uncertainty. And the OBR also was very explicit in saying that the uncertainty means that that could be wiped out very easily. And given that uncertainty, and given, as Ed just explained, that we're spending £83 billion, that's £1,200 for every man, woman and child in this country on debt interest payments. It's nearly 4 times what we spent last year. We have clearly got to be very careful about the fundamentals of our public finances.
And the fact is, as the Chancellor said in the House of Commons, it seems a lot of it is beyond our control. I mean, this is a chilling statement, isn't it? We should be prepared for the economy and the public finances to worsen, potentially significantly. How worried are you that we could be facing stagflation, stuttering, falling growth and rising inflation?
Well, it's not a question of worrying, it's a question of dealing with the situation as we see it. And we see a degree of uncertainty, and we have to actually respond to that. And what the Chancellor's done today, and I think you've been through some of the changes that he's announced, we've made some significant changes to the thresholds by which people pay tax. We've helped people by reducing fuel duty, something that hasn't happened for many, many years. But I recognise that this isn't going to solve every household's challenges over the coming months. But what the Chancellor also did in February is brought forward £350 for every household, particularly those in band A to D. In a couple of weeks, they'll receive £150 rebate on their council tax to assist with the cost of heating their homes. But these are extremely challenging times, and the Chancellor, as ever, has a balancing act, and he's also set very clearly what he wants to do with the future of the economy, creating the conditions for growth, investing, encouraging businesses to invest in capital, in human capital, and in ideas, so that the economy can grow and be in the best place to grow well out of the uncertainty that we see at the moment.
Okay.
But the OBR, sorry.
All right. I mean, just to get on to some of the more specific measures, some of the emissions, and it's been pointed out, why weren't the most vulnerable in society helped? Those on benefits, those out of work, those working part-time, people who don't have cars, they've been left out.
Well, of course, one of the big things that we did, following on not only from the fuel duty cut and the household the measures to help people with their fuel bills that I just mentioned, we've also doubled the household support money to £1 billion. And that will be money that will go through local authorities. And over the last 2 years, the Chancellor has put a number of interventions through the COVID crisis and worked with local authorities who've given those discretionary grants and formal grants out to local businesses and individuals. And so we're relying on that as a mechanism to help support some of the most vulnerable in our communities.
I mean, it sounds like a lot of money, £1 billion in that household support fund, but it's a one-off payment, isn't it? And you have to apply through your local authority. I mean, why not just increase universal credit, give it to everyone?
Well, we believe that local authorities have played a phenomenal role over the last couple of years, and we're just building on that experience. As I said, we used them to dispense grants to businesses, some of which were very clearly set out from Whitehall. Others were discretionary because we recognise that councillors up and down the country have a role to play in supporting their local communities, and we're providing the means for them to continue to do that. But I wouldn't want to hide from the fact that, having spent £400 billion, having now to spend £1,200 for every man, woman and child up and down the country next year in debt interest payments, these are very uncomfortable times. And obviously today we saw the growth forecast reduced to 3.8%. And we saw inflation at 6.2%. We haven't seen that for a very long time, as Ed pointed out on the graph earlier. And these are very uncomfortable times for the economy. What we've done today, what the Chancellor's done today, is put in some significant interventions that will help a lot of people. 30 million people will have over £300 more in the summer.
What about the windfall tax suggested by Labour and others on energy companies who are making an awful lot of money about the rise in energy prices? Surely that would have meant you could have done even more. Why didn't you do it?
I think there's two things I'd say there, Dermot. One is that these firms are already taxed much higher than other firms. And secondly, we want to create the conditions for them to invest. And I welcome BP's decision today to signal they're going to invest £1 billion in charging infrastructure.
But we do need to encourage very hefty dividends to their shareholders.
Well, what we need is we need to realise that if we're going to have a growing economy, we need businesses to invest in growth. And setting those conditions for growth is critically important. What we've also done is help smaller businesses by removing some more of the costs that they have to pay in terms of national insurance contributions, by increasing the allowance there. So that's another £1,000 that they will be saved from paying. So we've made a range of interventions, but the reason we haven't, to answer your question specifically, is because we don't want to act as a disincentive to investment, which is important as we need to grow the economy.
And just this badge you're going to wear into the next election, a Conservative Party overseeing a fall in real disposable incomes and the highest tax burden for 77 years. It's not a badge of pride, is it?
Well, no, I don't think anyone anticipated when we won the general election 2.5 years ago that we would go through COVID and spend $400 billion. I don't think we could have anticipated fully the extent of the crisis in the Ukraine. What we've got to do is keep calm, work through the issues and make decisions at each fiscal event in the interest of the British people, and that's what the Chancellor's done today.
John Glenn, very good talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News tonight. And that's it for our special programme on the Chancellor's Spring Statement. Coming up next on Sky News tonight, the latest on the war in Ukraine as we await the arrival of Air Force One and President Biden back in Europe. Now, Joe Biden is due to land in Europe any moment now before key summits of NATO and G7 leaders tomorrow. The aim of the meeting is to coordinate joint action on Europe's energy security and respond to continuing Russian aggression. The president is also expected to announce extra sanctions against Russia when he arrives in Brussels. Our US correspondent Mark Stone reports from Brussels.
As the American president left the White House for Europe, there was a stark answer for one of so many troubling questions.
How concerned are you about the threat of chemical warfare right now, that Russia would use chemical weapons? How high is that threat?
I think it's a real threat. Thank you. Given the stakes, given the bloodshed, perhaps it's a surprise that the American president has taken this long to travel to Europe to face the Russian threat. Ahead of him now are 3 summits, NATO, the EU and the G7, back-to-back in one day. It is an unprecedented reflection on the current state of peace and stability in Europe. And here it is, spelt out by propagandists, pundits connected to the Kremlin on Russian state TV.
Европе надо передать простую вещь. Вы получите ядерный удар по территории Европы. В случае, если вы соберетесь там с какой-нибудь миротворческий контингент НАТО создать, в случае, если вы соберетесь его куда-то там вводить и прочее, да, это будет ядерная война.
Hollow threats designed to spook, to create leverage. The thing is, who can be sure right now?
The leaders of the 30 NATO member countries will be forced to confront this extraordinary reality when they meet here in Brussels in the hours ahead. The headline will be a remarkable doubling of the number of NATO troops deployed to Eastern Europe, an unavoidable reaction to a Russian aggression that is so unpredictable. But how will President Putin react? Is it perhaps perilously provocative?
The alliance's Secretary-General, whose tenure may now be extended to provide continuity, could not clearly answer the biggest questions.
How does NATO defend itself against a nuclear attack? Thank you.
Russia must stop its nuclear saber rattling. This is dangerous and it is irresponsible.
For now, the Russian attacks on Ukraine remain conventional, but devastating nonetheless. These missiles, in footage issued by the Russian military, apparently hit Ukrainian military targets. Sky News is unable to verify the claim. Russia's foreign minister was preempting NATO announcements, and on a suggestion from Poland that it could send a peacekeeping force to Ukraine, he had this.
I hope they know what they are talking about. This will be that very confrontation between Russian and NATO armed forces that everyone not just wanted to avoid, but said that it should never happen to begin with.
His master, President Putin, told officials that Russia would continue to supply Europe with energy, but would charge in rubles. An attempt to shore up the plummeting ruble and undermine the dollar. There will be pressure at the EU summit on nations like Germany to cut loose from Russian energy, but that is so much easier said than done. So many challenges, so many frightening scenarios, and a blunt reality that nothing the West has done so far has ended Putin's war.
Mark Stone joins me now live from Brussels. So, Mark, the president aiming to maintain unity and turn the screw further on Russia.
Yeah, and you know, Dermot, I suppose on reflection, isn't it a bit of a surprise that it's taken the American president this long to come to Europe, given the stakes, given the bloodshed in Ukraine? It has taken quite some time for a decision to be made that he would come here, that he would be here in person for this, not just one summit, as I say, but a trio of summits. It's worth pointing out that he has been pushing for these summits to take place. There was a suggestion not all that long ago that maybe there wouldn't be a NATO summit. Well, there is. They're having it. And as I say, alongside that, EU leaders will meet. President Biden will join EU leaders at their meeting here in the centre of Brussels. And separately, there'll be a G7 meeting as well. And the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has just arrived in the European Commission headquarters to meet Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, for meetings tonight ahead of those big meetings tomorrow. We're just awaiting the US President's arrival at Zaventem Airport, not far from the centre of Brussels here. Where he will travel from there to the American embassy, and tomorrow he will be a central part of such high-stakes diplomatic discussion.
OK, Mark, thank you very much indeed. You're watching Sky News tonight. Coming up, we'll have the very latest, as Mark was describing there, on the president's visit to Europe and also the Chancellor's spring statement.